let me just read it out for you.
Set the scene for me, Cam.
Yeah, here we go. Everybody's had a bad boss at some point. You know what I'm talking about. A boss who constantly undermines you or plays favorites. A boss who takes credit for your work when things go well and blames you when things go badly. Some of us have had the misfortune to experience something even worse. An abusive boss who yells at people, insults them, reams them out in front of the rest of the team. A boss like this makes you want to quit. But what about that boss? What are they getting out of all this shouting and aggression? What on earth are they thinking when they behave like this? Not many people actually set out to become a bad boss. So how does someone end up this way? What goes wrong? This is where Winny Shen comes in. Winny is an associate professor of organization studies at the Schulich School of Business at York University, and she studies bad bosses. Listen up. So Winnie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a delight to talk with you and to talk more in depth about your research than I usually get a chance to, because we're usually talking about things at faculty council and so on. Tell me about yourself, the role that you play at the school, and what your research is all about.
Sure. So I'm currently an associate professor of organization studies at Schulich School of Business. I'm also affiliated with the Faculty Scholar Program at the Crumble Center for Health Management and Leadership. So I'm a professor of organization studies, specializing in leadership, diversity, and inclusion issues in the workplace, as well as worker well-being.
Worker well-being is a huge topic, especially, the experiences a lot of people had coming out of the pandemic and the pressure people are getting to go back to the office. There's a whole bunch of structural factors at play in that. You are interested in some particular dynamics in the workplace. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So I'm interested in basically how work affects our health, but also to some extent how our health affects how we work, the reciprocal relationship there. I'm very interested both in terms of the job demands and responsibilities we're facing and how that affects us and our stress responses, but also sometimes how we can feel crushed between our work and our family or non-work lives and trying to handle all those responsibilities all together and together how we all manage those things. But I'm really excited today to talk about some of my work around bad bosses because I think this is a topic that really resonates with everyone. Everyone's got a horror story or two.
No doubt. You've got a paper, the title of it is Bad, Mad, or Glad. And this is looking at abusive supervision and emotions in the workplace. Can you tell us a little bit about that study?
Yeah, so where this study came from was we really wanted to get into the mindset of these leaders who sometimes yell, scream, belittle, because, as you said, we really think that people don't set out to be bad bosses. Yet, I think even on our maybe on our worst days, we find ourselves engaging in some of those behaviors. So the question we had was, well, how do bosses feel? To give us some insight into, do they know what they're doing is bad? You know, or do they feel that these behaviors are justified and they actually feel fine? And so that was the question we set out to answer and try to better understand, getting ourselves into the minds of these leaders. And what we find actually is that it really varies. So some leaders really do feel bad. They feel regretful, they feel shame. They really wish that they didn't act in that way. Other leaders, though, feel fine. In fact, some of them feel better than fine. They feel more relaxed, more calm after it. They feel like they got something off their chest. And so I think that's really interesting because what we know from emotions research is that suggests to us that those leaders might continue to do these behaviors again because they actually feel some sort of relief or have gotten some sort of positive feedback in terms of, I actually feel better after yelling at my for performing subordinate. And other leaders continue to feel mad. So it's interesting too, in that it doesn't seem to have fixed the problem for some of them. If they were trying to get something off their chest, it didn't completely go away. They continue to feel mad.
You talked about getting into the minds of these people. How does the research actually take place? How do you find out what they're thinking?
So, my research often uses surveys to ask participants how they feel. Sometimes we will also do interviews where we can talk to people about their experiences. Often we will ask them to maybe walk us through a specific instance where they yelled or screamed to try to get into the nuances and the details, and also so that we can probe more in terms of like it can be useful because sometimes what we found in this research was people would say things like, I feel bad. But there's actually nuances in terms of what that bad means. Some people might say, I feel bad, and they really feel guilty, right? They really feel regretful. They really wish they hadn't done that. Other people feel shame, but shame is actually somewhat different than guilt. Shame means you feel bad, but it often doesn't make you want to fix what you've done. It often makes you want to engage in behaviors like avoid that person because that person reminds you of something that you wish you didn't do, but it doesn't necessarily make you want to go and apologize to that person. And so, if we engage in interviews or more follow up questions, sometimes we can start to tease apart some of these nuances that sometimes can be difficult to capture when we just have asked people to respond to a survey.
So, when a person feels negatively about this, about their own behavior as an abusive boss, you've got the guilt possibility, you've got the shame possibility. What should be done in those two cases? Is there a different intervention, and who's responsible for making that intervention?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think what our work shows is that you only feel guilt and shame if you feel that you are at least partially responsible for what happened. And so I think the first thing for a manager or a leader to keep in mind is that um, we all tend to wear rose colored glasses when it comes to ourselves. And so our reflex is often to blame the subordinate or the external circumstance, right? I ended up yelling because, that the deadline was near, or, I had told the subordinate so many times before about it, and it just pushed me over the edge today, right? These are the types of justifications that often come very easily to ourselves. And so, what I would encourage managers to think about is we'll try to adopt the lens of the people you're managing. Could you have contributed to that situation in some way? And if so, I think you're much more likely to feel guilt and shame. Now, the research would suggest that guilt is a lot more of a beneficial emotion, in that when we feel guilty, what it's supposed to tell us is that you've done something wrong, but now's your opportunity to do something about it, right? So when we feel guilty, we often apologize, we try to make amends, we promise to do better. Whereas shame is a more no, there are no bad emotions, but shame is a little bit more of a tricky emotion. Because often when we feel shame, it means that we've internalized what has happened into kind of this broader issue. So instead of saying, "Oh, I messed up. I shouldn't have yelled today." Shame often reflects we've overgeneralized. So it actually we start thinking things like, "I'm a bad boss. I'm a person who can't control my emotions." And once you start thinking these kind of global negative thoughts about yourself, it can be really hard to feel like you have the capacity to change it, right? Because you're like, "Oh no, I'm a bad boss," right? And that's not very motivating for people. And what often happens then is people avoid, withdraw. They try not to interact with situations that might force them to confront the fact that maybe they're not a great boss. So I would encourage leaders to or managers to really think about, not to go too far down a rabbit hole, right? Really focus on that instance and thinking about, well, how can I repair this relationship? How can I come back? As opposed to maybe sometimes thinking like, oh no, yeah, I'm a horrible boss. Nothing can be done. This person hates me forever. Which I think sometimes we can fall into those types of problematic thought patterns.
You've got a phrase in this paper called growth mindset. What's a growth mindset and what difference does it make?
Yeah, so a growth mindset is really about the extent to which you think that people can change or people are who they are. So someone on high growth mindset sees things as just how they currently are, but not necessarily how they have to be or need to be like this forever, including themselves and their subordinates, right? So if I have a growth mindset, I think that I can learn, develop, and change, and so can the people around me. Whereas if I am low on growth mindset, sometimes we refer to it as someone with more of a fixed mindset. We often think about things as unchangeable. I am who I am, right? And sometimes we see this when we talk to students who will say things like, I'm bad at math, right? As if this was a permanent thing. It's not a skill that they can develop, right? And in the same ways, if you kind of are a manager who tends to have a fixed mindset, then you're like, I am who I am, right? I have a hard time controlling my emotions. Sometimes I'm kind of a aggressive, hard-nosed boss. That's who I am, right? And there's no other way I can be. And in the same way, you also think when your employees mess up, like that's who they are. They're a bad performer, right? There's no hope for them.
Mhm.
Whereas I think what we find in our research is that the managers who have a higher growth mindset, they're less likely to feel this overarching sense of shame when they mess up and act as a bad boss in an instance. And we think that that is more healthy because it suggests that instead of just becoming kind of like sunk into the situation thinking like, okay, well, it is what it is now. If you can take yourself out of that shame spiral, it means that you can see that it's just a potentially just a one-off, right? It's something that you have control over. It's something that you don't have to just take for granted as this is the way the situation is forever. And so developing this growth mindset, I think, is the research suggests that it's changeable. So even if you have a tendency to see things as fixed, you can work on that. You can try to challenge yourself to reframe things, right? I think we all feel this way. And, I often try to do this for myself when I think about things like, sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm just not a good writer, and then I say, no, like I know that I've improved a lot in my writing over the years, right? And so, but sometimes there's that tendency, and then you kind of have to bring yourself back to try to encourage yourself to be like, no, is that really true or not? In terms of am I really stuck like this, or can I change? Can I develop? Can I work on this? Right.
Let's go back to those bosses who basically think that the whole problem arises with the subordinate. It's not their fault at all. The reason that they're having to, display these aggressive, abusive behaviors is because the subordinate is to blame somehow. Do they experience these emotions, these negative emotions of guilt and shame?
They do. Say they do, but it's maybe not as frequently as one would hope. A lot of the times that, as I mentioned before, they actually feel fine. So part of it is we think is that managers, because of some of these biases that cause us to blame others or kind of um, tell us about the situation in a way that's most beneficial to our own self-esteem, we often will not experience these negative emotions. But I think these negative emotions, although they feel bad, they really are a signal to us about a problem, right? And unless you feel these emotions and realize there's a problem, then you'll kind of keep engaging in these negative behaviors. And there's a lot of research suggesting that they are negative behaviors. It really negatively affects both the health and well being of those around you, those that you're managing, also, it makes them really want to leave the organization. It's really a nasty, toxic environment for them to feel like they have a boss who is just um, mean, unsupportive, right? Trying to take advantage of them. It's a very exhausting environment for people to be in, and no one likes it. And I think that's why, whenever we all have these stories, you often hear about people trying to, look for new jobs, get out of those situations.
Mhm. Use the word toxic, which is something we're familiar with, these toxic workplace environments. In that sort of a situation where this bad boss is actually getting something out of it and blaming the subordinates for the situation, is there a way out of that? Who's responsible for changing that situation?
Yeah, so I think, we would say that bad bosses, I think there's multiple ways to think about it, right? So, of course, I think organizations have a role to play. Bad bosses, we know, are more likely in certain kinds of environments where these types of behaviors go unchecked or they're kind of permitted, right? In some environments, you'll hear about these bad bosses as tough love, right? They reframe it as kind of a positive, or, it's like, oh, well, sometimes people need tough love in order to get good performance out of people. And so I think that that is kind of a problematic rhetoric in terms of it makes people think that these kinds of behaviors are okay. Whereas I think the research really shows that these behaviors aren't great for anyone. It's not great for the subordinates, but also it's actually really challenging for the bosses, right? Um, a lot of times when people engage in these behaviors, they sometimes will feel guilt, and sometimes they spend a lot of time ruminating and just thinking about these behaviors because we all want to think about ourselves as capable, good people. And engaging in these behaviors that, although sometimes they're more permitted in certain work environments, generally we know that yelling, screaming, belittling people is not how people want to be treated. It forces us to kind of confront a negative, ugly side to ourselves. And what we see is that a lot of times when bosses are dealing with that, it can actually cause them to burn out a little bit. Kind of knowing that they're engaging in these behaviors is what we call kind of like psychologically challenging, right? It kind of bursts your bubble that you're a good person a little bit. And so I think actually we spend a lot of time talking about how this is really challenging for the people whose bosses act this way, but there's actually now some evidence that suggests that it's actually pretty bad for the bosses too. And so getting people out of this mindset where, like maybe these behaviors are okay sometimes, I think is probably better for everyone.
Mhm. You've got a second paper entitled Leading Through the Uncertainty of COVID-19. And this is a paper that gets into the question of gender and how that shapes these abusive relationships. Can you tell us about the role of gender in this dynamic?
Yeah. So, not in my own work, but more broadly in the literature, we know that women are less likely to engage in these mean, abusive leadership behaviors. What we show in this paper is a little bit different in that that's on average, right? On average, day to day, maybe there's no cause for you to yell or scream, right? What we're really interested in is when there is a stressor involved, how leaders react. And so in the pandemic, what we see and find is that, as you may recall, it was a really anxious, scary time, right? And what we know is that sometimes people engage in these abusive, bad leader behaviors when they're stressed because it's a way to both feel powerful and feel like you're in control. And so we really saw the pandemic as a potential time where, because of all this anxiety and all this stress, leaders actually may be more likely to engage in some of these bad behaviors. And we find was that is true, but only for men. So the more a male leader was anxious about the pandemic, the more likely their subordinates were to report that, yeah, this guy's yelling, this guy's like belittling, this guy's taking credit for my work. But that wasn't actually true for women, where regardless of how anxious women leaders felt about the pandemic, they generally refrain from engaging in abusive supervision. And so our idea was, well, maybe this is because um, women leaders are socialized to lead differently. They're more other oriented. And so they're more focused on what their subordinates need or their direct reports need as opposed to how they're feeling. Whereas I think maybe some people would call this emotional intelligence. Men are not necessarily socialized this way. And so they tend to act more upon how they're feeling in the moment and in that way affect the people around them.
Mhm. I remember just how challenging it was as a teacher to be looking after, trying our best to look after the emotions of our students during the pandemic. So I'm acutely aware of how stressful that was. But you're saying that given that stress of the pandemic, women didn't tend to take it out on their subordinates. Women bosses didn't tend to take it out on their subordinates in the same way. So where are they getting that secret ingredient, that magic potion that keeps them from passing on that stress?
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting and something that we don't get into in this work, but would love to dig more into in the future and understand. What I'm really worried about, though we don't know, is I'm really worried about at what cost, right? And that's something that we don't explore in that research project, but I'm very curious about in terms of, are women really working really hard to be attentive to others, but in some ways that's really draining on them. And so they're kind of carrying that burden on their own versus, is it more due to how women tend to be socialized in society such that this comes more automatically to them, and there isn't this huge cost because this tends to be how they operate. We don't know, but I think that's something that's worth teasing apart in the future in terms of women's leaders seem to do this, but I am very curious about if it's costing them something on the back end or not. And it's another maybe a piece of the toll that they're carrying around during the pandemic, the emotions of others and also their own, but trying to not let it negatively impact other people.
That sounds like an important topic for sure. Let's talk about the importance of the research that you've done right now. You've got these two papers. One of them looks at the role of um, the attribution of toxic behavior, abusive behavior by the boss. Do they think it's the subordinate's fault, or do they think it's their own fault and they feel guilty or shameful? And then you've got this other paper that looks at the effect of gender, the differences of gender in this abusive relationship when people are under stress. What can people take away from that? How can that be applied or absorbed into workplace dynamics now?
Yeah, so I think that what I take away from some of this work is um, that I would say uh, being a manager or being a leader is really stressful, right? Stress is often a part of the job. And so I think for me, given that we know that abusive supervision is one way that people deal with that stress, you might argue not in a particularly healthy way. I think for a leader, my question to them would be, what are you doing to manage your stress so that you know that you're not going to inadvertently take things out on people or just explode because you're carrying such a big load on on your shoulders. So for me, that's one piece to really think about. The other is really this broader, other-oriented perspective. Thinking about what my subordinates need, being open to the possibility that I contributed to the problem, and really we talk about this in some of the MBA classes, which is, I think one of the things that leaders really struggle with, and one of the things I think our students often struggle with is I think students have these really good goals or aspirations in terms of like, I'm going to be a great boss and all these things, and I'm going to take time to reflect and make sure I don't do these things. But one of the things that managers always feel short on is time, right? And it's often the choice between like, "Oh, I'm gonna take time to slow down and think about, that situation and how I could have handled it better," versus, "I've got 10 other fires to put out. I've got all these deadlines," right? Like, people are knocking on my doors, then these emails never end. And often I think people feel that those things have more immediacy and that, reflection is something I'll do when I have time. But the reality is maybe you'll never have time unless you make time, right? And so I think sometimes then we fall into these patterns where we're not helping ourselves think about what kind of leader we want to be, helping us learn from our mistakes. And all of that requires us to be really, really mindful. So I think for me, one of the big takeaways is really finding time to make sure I don't turn into a bad boss. That might be managing my stress, thinking about what others might need, thinking about how I might have contributed to the problem. All of these things, though, I think makes requires time and space for us to really get into that. And so I think part of being a good leader is that. And we see examples all through the news. Some people might argue that Elon Musk, is kind of an abusive boss based on some of these descriptions. So we have some successful models out there engaging in these negative behaviors, right? And I think that can sometimes also lull us into the sense of, it can't be all bad, right? Some people are doing this and being really successful. But I think on the flip side, I would ask them at what cost to the people around them, but also to themselves, right? That part we often don't see.
Mhm. Just to pivot this around, is there a corporate governance aspect to this about policies and supervision of, even at the very top, supervision by the board of CEOs or supervision of senior managers by the CEO?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think more generally, some organizations have tried to mandate norms around civility in like discourse and behaviors. Now, of course, I think what's a little bit tricky is that civility is to some extent subjective, right? Really see that around things like sometimes jokes, where somebody would say like that's just a joke, and other people would say that was really inappropriate, right? And so, because we are not always on the same page, um, this is hard, I think, to mandate in practice. And what it actually, I think, requires is um, open conversations, right? In order to give people feedback in terms of like, hey, actually, I really didn't appreciate how you talked to me there, right? And it doesn't have to be confrontational, it doesn't have to be ugly, but a lot of times we don't have those conversations. We just sweep it under the rug. But that doesn't mean we're not resentful of how we were talked to or treated, right? So I think part of it is I think civility norms are great, but I think they really only work when we have the right environment where we can give each other constructive feedback in terms of like, hey, you know, how do I really would appreciate being treated? And also giving people grace when they mess up and giving them another chance. I think that's part of of relationships. I think we can all mess up, yell, accidentally cut someone off. These are things that happen, but I think it's how we manage them. Of course, we want to minimize the number of times we do them. We can't just be going around yelling at everyone and then go on an apology tour. I don't think that makes a great leader either. But also understanding maybe sometimes people are really under a lot of stress, and this is not how they would like to act. It was an impulse in the moment, but then having a conversation about, how they could avoid that in the behavior, also just letting them know, it was noticed and, it kind of negatively affected you.
Do you have any specific examples you could give me of exercises you do in the classroom or group projects or anything like that in the classroom around this topic?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think I would encourage leaders to do is so there is a measure of abusive supervision, a validated one. And often how it's used in the literature is we ask subordinates to answer it in response to their boss. So it'll ask something like, how often does your leader do things like take credit for, your work? And so often what I would be find helpful, I think, to open people's perspectives is fill it out once thinking about kind of what a recent boss, right? Get yourself in that subordinate's perspective. And you may be able to think about instances where that boss treated you less than ideally, right? And then I would tell you to fill it again, thinking about maybe one of your subordinates, maybe one that you don't have a great relationship with, actually. How would they fill it out? I think sometimes it's actually illuminating to realize, like, oh, this person might think about me in ways that I think about, these bosses that I don't love and appreciate, right? I think sometimes putting ourselves in another person's perspective to kind of take stock of like, how are we behaving? I think can be really helpful. I think part of it is, um, the other thing that's also really tricky is the higher you go up in an organization, the less real feedback you get, right? People really, you have power, you have control over people's pay, their resources, people often are scared of telling people negative feedback as they go higher up. But that also means that you're not hearing how people really feel about you. And so I think the other thing I often encourage my students to think about is how are you going to get real feedback as you become successful and climb up the corporate ladder? How are you going to either nurture trusted confidants who can pull you inside and be like, hey, like that meeting really didn't go well, right? Or I don't know if you know, but so and so was crying in the corner afterwards, right? Because they probably will hide from you to do it and you'll never know. And so I think you have to be really intentional and think about like, well, how am I going to get real feedback when you know that a lot of people are just going to tell you what they think you want to hear, right? And that's kind of a scary place to be in some ways.
Hmm. No kidding. Tell me what you've got coming up. Have you got any new papers you're working on or workshops you're planning?
Yeah, so I'm really excited. My colleague Keaton Fletcher and I are working on a book proposal. We're trying to consolidate some of these things we've learned about bad bosses and trying to write an accessible book to help people, continue this conversation in terms of how can we help people avoid becoming a bad boss. I think I like to think about it as a am I the asshole, a boss version in terms of I think sometimes we need to get a little bit of outside perspective, outside feedback in terms of like, and also a different perspective on what happened, right? I think if you ask a subordinate, sometimes they would be like, I'm really unmotivated because my boss is so mean, so unsupportive, right? Whereas I think maybe from the boss's perspective, you're likely to say things like, well, I've told this person, stuff how to improve on this a million times and they just, don't get any better. And so like, I'm yelling at them because I need some way to prompt them into action. Right. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? In terms of who's right, who's wrong. It's a difference in perspective. Now, I think more important thing is, well, how do you resolve the situation, right? As opposed to really just standing by your version of events, right?
Mm. Yes, unfortunately, work in the business world often requires adult, mature behavior and doesn't always bring it out of people. Challenging situation.
This is kind of an interesting thing that I've noticed on social media sites too, is people posting texts and emails they get from bad bosses, which is usually some sort of online argument.
Mhm.
Do you find that the communication medium changes how employees and bosses interact? Have you come across any sort of literature or research that goes on that sort of space?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit interesting. There is some work that shows that um we have less context when we get an email, right? And we also are a little bit less deliberate when we shoot off emails. So we're actually more likely to come across as rude than in person, where we can get kind of immediate feedback, right? If I start saying something that's a little bit, my tone is wrong, like Cam Space might tell me, coming on too strong, need to back up. Whereas I don't get that feedback over email, right? And there's like lots of nuances, for example, like exclamation marks, or all caps is screaming, right? Where there might be these differences in norms in terms of how to write these emails, how quick, response times are. A lot of this can feel kind of rude, like, not respecting people's boundaries and things like that. And so I actually think that these email communications are more fraught than interpersonal communication, and also because, people often won't say anything about a rude email, but that doesn't mean that they are upset by it or annoyed by it, but they often won't bring it up again. So I actually think that people should be more careful in their email communications, because I think we often tend to be very short, very curt, no niceties. And maybe we think that, that's saving people time, right? Less to read. But I think sometimes it can come across as very demanding, very rude.
And just one other thing too. In all your research and all your discussions, have you ever come across one of those bad bosses who might have been talked about in, say, an article or one of those viral posts? And do you know if they ever had any sort of reaction or how they might have internalized that and acted on it? Just some, maybe your personal experiences.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think that most of the time, um, when we see it as more like a style, right? Where someone's kind of style is very abrasive, very rude. I think that's a bit different from people who slip up, you know, and yell or do something, or, under a certain period of time, under this project deadline, they blow up a little bit more often because they're under a lot of stress. I think those are somewhat different situations. I think that if someone's turned this into a style, it's probably difficult to convince them in the short term that this is an ineffective style. Because part of the reasons people develop these styles is because they've modeled it off of people around them. So there's some interesting research, for example, that like, your leadership style is a little bit like your parents' parenting style, right? That they're your first model in terms of how an authority figure should behave. And so I think if you are not exposed to a lot of alternative models, I think it can be hard to convince people there's any other way to lead. Or if you're in certain environments, maybe that's really competitive and all the leaders are like this. I think it's hard to take feedback that this is a problematic leadership behaviors when it's all around you, right? So like I think it's hard to convince people in certain environments or who've kind of developed this over time that this is problematic. I think that's a long unlearning process for a lot of people. Whereas I think, the more specific instances, I think that, people are often open to feedback, and some people already feel guilt, right? And so there that can be an opening to talk to people about this and kind of resolve the situation and put it to bed. But unfortunately, for some people, it's more than a one off. It's how they are a lot of the time.
Thank you so much, Winnie, for talking with me. It's a joy to learn about your research. Is there any way that people can get in touch with you? Are you on LinkedIn or Twitter or anything like
Yeah,
that?
I am on LinkedIn and on Twitter, so feel free to reach me through either channel.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kim.